Welcome to episode 33 of the Irish Mags Show. My name is Paul. I'll be your host for today. And joining me, we have a very special guest who we've very much been looking forward to bringing you on the Irish Mags Show, especially amidst all of the ongoing transfer rumour madness that's already sprouting very early in this summer transfer window. This is a man who has not only spent over a decade in the sports betting industry, but is also the founder of the groundbreaking data intelligence sports platform StatsBomb, whose data and IQ platforms allow football teams and more to get an edge on the competition in terms of player recruitment, scouting, performance analysis, and opposition evaluation, and who are trusted by over 280 elite teams globally. I may ask him to divulge some of these if he's at liberty to do so. More recently, he has also founded The Transfer Flow, which is a free online newsletter and podcast which combines transfer rumors and smart analysis to help identify the best and most suitable players linked with various clubs worldwide. And with the ever-growing circulation of ITKs and excitable transfer rumors in the Newcastle United world, it couldn't make more sense that we invite him on the Irish Mags Show at this point in time. Welcome in, Mr. Ted Knutson. It's great to have you here, sir. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be on board.
Absolutely, yeah. We're delighted to have you here. We often bring various guests on the show, Ted, and we like to create a false sense of Irish, hospitality. I've been having a chat with you before we hit the big red button, but that's going to change very quickly as we bring the focus onto you. Before I do that, though, we always have to ask our guests, any Irish connections, any notable anecdotes or stories, or have you visited Ireland, anything to share with our esteemed Irish Mags listeners?
Like most Americans, I have Irish ancestry. It's probably very mild. Like my last name is Danish and Norwegian, so the Vikings were more recent than that. But yeah, plenty of Irish ancestry. Been to Ireland a couple of times. Actually, I think for 2 different Magic the Gathering tournaments, as well as a wedding at the Guinness sort of factory area that they throw this. Yeah, so that's my more recent experiences anyway.
That's not a bad one to go, in fairness. And the visit to the Guinness Storehouse, I think it actually got voted as like one of the best, if not the best, like tourist visitor experience in Europe or something. So
it was really good.
We're doing something right. Yeah.
And delicious. Right, for sure. So that's the important part.
Yes, even though one of my normal co-hosts, he's not here now, is a cider enthusiast and doesn't like Guinness. And to be honest, it's a travesty. We shouldn't even allow him on anymore. But that's for another day.
That's like a sweet tart path versus sort of the bitter caramel path. So you can see how it works either way there. Yeah.
I'm not impressed, though, with his behavior. He's been slagging off the Guinness lately, and we don't like it at all. Anyway, on today's show, we're going to hear a little bit about Ted's background, working in sports betting and data analysis. Before diving straight into our spotlight, we'll be discussing some of the biggest Newcastle United transfer rumours to date, but more importantly, putting a data analyst head on. More so Ted than me, I can assure you of that. Where we're going to be using some elite data that Ted has compiled to first of all look at Newcastle in terms of defensive and attacking phases over last season and into the new season, and then looking at some of the reported transfer rumours and players linked with Newcastle for a few key specific roles that we know the club are looking at strengthening. So Ted, as I said, we're going to start with you. And I guess, look, before we dive into all of the data and the heavy analysis, for anyone that's listening who doesn't know who you are, maybe if you could give us a little bit of your background. I've obviously shared a little bit, but I think that's only a real snippet of your own background and what you've been working on all the way up to now in the present day.
Yeah, it's quite unusual. Sometimes the younger people ask me, like, how do I get to do what you've done? Like, how do I replicate your career? And I have no idea how I got here. And so I've absolutely no advice on how to do this. Let's see. I started out in economics and politics degree at University of Oklahoma, went to graduate school, dropped out of graduate school, because the tech era, the first tech boom was just starting then. And I looked around at the job market and I was like, in 2 years' time, I can probably make what my professor's making and not have to do like all of the garbage work and the pain of a PhD. So did that for a few years, ended up being a database administrator, then left my job during the trough after the dot-com boom, the dot-com crash, and started writing about Magic the Gathering and took a job in that, which is a sort of strategic card game that's been around for a long time. If you're a Post Malone fan, you probably know that he's like a really big Magic the Gathering player, as are many other people. that led into the poker boom, which led into sports betting, which led into turning around one of the world's largest online bookies. So I rebuilt a company called Pinnacle from 2007 to 2014 to a worldwide facing in their product suite. And I was a trader of the English Premier League for a long time. So the people that actually sort of control the odds, like I was that guy for a long time, and I was very good at it. Then a career change, a bit like what you're getting ready to do, except in this case, my wife had asked me not to work every single weekend because we had two small children. And I'd be like, oh, it'd be nice to have you around a parent once in a while. I was like, that's a very clear idea of what I should be doing.
Hard to argue with that.
yeah, exactly. So I started looking around for other potential jobs, and I met a man named Matthew Benham, who hired me to be the head of player analytics for Brentford and Midtjylland, their Danish sister club. So worked there for a couple of years, won a Danish title, kind of laid some of the groundwork for Brentford to go from League One up through into the Premier League, and left that job, looked around the football industry thinking we'd been quite successful and this was really interesting. Somebody will jump right away for whatever's next. And the football world hadn't moved very much in that couple of years. So I started a company called StatsBomb. We did consulting first. We had done a lot of stuff sort of publicly on the internet before I got hired at Brentford, and then built that from nothing into a 10 million pound a year revenue company. Just recently decided to work on something new, and that's when the transfer flow came about. So unlike most of the ITKs, I actually have worked deeply inside of football, both in an actual role inside of a club, and then guiding some teams doing, head coach replacements, transfer replacements as a consultancy and a data company over the last sort of 10 years. I will say that your club is a customer of ours. They were in the bar at Stamford Bridge, Chelsea, when the announcement came on Sky Sports that you would have new ownership and that Mike Ashley sale was finally going through. And there was lots of cheering, and they were coming on board as customers immediately afterwards because they intended to have real action in the transfer market.
I had a feeling, but equally, and this applies to many aspects of Newcastle, probably a little bit slightly late to the party when you consider, the likes of Brentford. I mean, I'm a big Football Manager enthusiast, as you see on the wall here. So like Football Manager, obviously you'll know, like it's all about data and that little element of being a complete nerd when it comes to football. But I've seen very clearly, like Brentford's model. Obviously, you have the affiliation with Nordsjælland and the player movement between there. And I think many people just think that's down to, they share techniques and coaching and they've got player knowledge and they move her up. But it's way deeper than that. Obviously, you will have seen that and done that in the role you've done. And so many more clubs, I think Brighton are probably another one people would associate with being a bit more data-led. But it does feel like, in my mind, if I was to think about who was the first club doing it really, really well, it seems like it was Brentford when I think back. And that's clear in a club of their size playing even where they are now and over to an extent overperforming in a league such as the Premier League. Super interesting.
It was definitely Brentford and Liverpool, and to a lesser extent Arsenal. Like Arsenal had the tools and they had the people, but they weren't listening to them. Brighton, it took a little bit longer for their progression, but they might be the best in the world right now. Now that Michael Edwards is back at Liverpool, they'll also be right up there. But there's a variety of teams that are doing it really well at the moment. I think City Football Group actually have done a lot of that, and sort of figuring out how to assess talent around the world and help guide that as well. Newcastle were a bit late to the party, and it's been an interesting thing to watch from the outside because I don't have any real insight there. Like different people, I was the CEO of the company, but other people sort of dealt with the day-to-day there. There seem to be like some different ideas as to what should be done in the transfer market for the current term versus also the long term.
Yeah, and I mean, again, our listeners will know our previous approach to recruitment and transfers was Lee Charnley, who held all of the roles in one, doing it himself. I think they attempted to bring Dennis Wise in at one point, did not go. It was a very haphazard approach. It reminds me of that movie Moneyball, where it's that kind of transition moment where all of the old school baseball scouts are in the room and they're like, so you don't want to listen to any of our players? And it's like, no, we're actually going to look into this and look at the data and buying the runs. Now, that's an extreme example maybe. It might not work the same in football. But that's the evolution of Newcastle. I think we can see and feel for sure it's changing not just the ownership and the money, but obviously the approach. And it's welcomed by all of the Newcastle fans who have seen it done not very well in the past. Excellent. Okay, I do have to ask you, it's been on my mind, just in the back of my mind there. Do you actually have a team that you would say you support or follow, or would it be Brentford for that reason? Or
No. So Brentford was very much a thing where I came into there. It was fun to help build that team. But then it's like all the players that I helped recruit transitioned out, or almost all of them. There's like one or two left. Then at that point, I felt like sort of I was clean. I didn't need to do it. And in a lot of ways, like I kind of root for my friends. So there are a couple coaches that at Michelin that I was there with, and they won our title. They were the attacking and defensive side coaches. Now Brian Priska, he's the replacement for Arne Slot over at Feyenoord, and he had just won, I think, 2 titles at AS or at Sparta Prague. And then Lars Friis, who is the attacking coach, now has replaced him at Sparta Prague. So kind of root for those guys and places that you have friends. But the reality is, and I hate to disappoint here, but I'm an Arsenal fan. I became an Arsenal fan in 1998, and it was actually kind of close at the time between Arsenal and Newcastle. I think that season you guys had the glorious Newcastle Brown Ale on the center of your kit, and Shearer was, the best sort of striker, or well, he was among the conversation at that point. But
no, he was the best. You can say it. He was the best. We already know.
All right. But Thierry Henry is also going to quickly come into that conversation. And so at the time, it was between those two after the '98 World Cup. Obviously, I liked England. I ended up moving here 14 years ago, but it was just that Arsenal were so much better and in the highlights so much more often. And they had, multiple World Cup winners, and they had Dennis Bergkamp. And you're like, all right, well, they kind of won me over. If Newcastle had been better for a longer period of time that time, I might have ended up as a Magpie.
Quite possibly. You mentioned that lovely kit. You could have been watching these guys here over my shoulder, the likes of Peter Beardsley and Faustino Esprit and Les Ferdinand. But we can't really. I mean, it's hard to argue against it. Arsenal obviously went on. You had the Invincibles, phenomenal team, phenomenal manager, and as you said, we're already.
David Ginola was a hell of a fun player to watch for a bit as well.
Yeah, he just again like that. He didn't stay at Newcastle as long as we would have liked either, which was a shame. Just the one thing you should just never do is mention Thierry Henry to an Irish person. Okay, just for future reference. We're still not over it, even though it was 2009. It was 15, 16 years ago. We're not over it, so we never will.
The Irish hold a grudge.
Is that a surprise to you?
Culturally, perhaps, it's a thing that you guys do
for many reasons. Yeah, we've been scorned, and we have our reasons, and we're sticking to them. Excellent. Look, thank you for sharing all that. That I could sit here and actually start asking you so many questions about Brentford and Michelin and like youth academies development. I may even have to book you in for a round 2. But I think we probably need to turn the focus a little bit onto Newcastle, because we have a lot to cover. And I know you've been doing a lot of work, which I really appreciate, because not only are our listeners going to be treated to, let's call it an ad hoc data analysis session on Newcastle in terms of tactics and approach, and also on players and recruitment.
We promise you it'll be painless.
I'm going to learn a lot here.
It's not going to hurt. It sounds like, when you say it, it sounds like an appointment at the dentist where, like, they might need to knock you out in order to get through it. But no, it's sexy transfer talk is what we're doing. We're just doing it from a perspective of how the club probably do it, which is looking around for players that match their data profiles. And then you do real scouting on them. And then you probably argue with Eddie Howe that this is worth it or not worth it. And then, maybe you eventually sign players.
I have to check if I'm going to be allowed to name this week's show as sexy transfer talk.
Absolutely.
I don't know how YouTube will treat that, but
you have my permission.
I absolutely
anyway.
love that. That's all we need. Okay. Well, we're going to bring up some graphics on screen, and as I do that, I'm going to ask Ted to introduce us to, basically, I suppose, Ted, you call it the radar graphic, I guess
that's correct.
The best terminology for it. So we're going to be looking at it, obviously, from a team perspective, and then we're going to jump into some player analysis. So maybe we could start there. I'm going to bring up one of the graphics you sent me, which is Newcastle United's attacking radar for last season, the 23-24 season. So before we kind of dive into what this tells us, maybe if you could just kind of explain to me and the listeners kind of how to interpret this or what we're looking at.
Okay, so one of the things that we do is try and use data to provide quick ways to figure out how a team's playing, what they're good at, what they're not good at. If you're on the outside of the radar, you're in the top 5% of those different metrics. And so what we're seeing, and then usually the more area or more color a radar has, the better the team has performed in that particular phase of play. So this is the attacking radar here. So when we look at it, like Newcastle had almost 1.7 expected goals per game. That's actually quite good in attack. I know last season might have been considered a bit of a disappointment, but the attack was a good thing. Shots were pretty good at a little over 14 per game, but the quality of the shots, the expected goals per shot, is really strong. And then you kind of get down to the bottom side where you've got counterattacking shots, set piece expected goals, and high press shots. And those are basically saying, okay, how are they generating these shots? Are they generating them in sort of particular ways that we care about? Counterattacking shots is usually, are they creating, quick counterattacking opportunities? And then the other side is like, are they creating shots off of high press? And that's a thing that you need to know walking in the door, because if your players are going to get pressed aggressively inside of a match, like you will start your sessions at the start of the week to be discussing that. So they need to be warned about it, play the ball quickly. This is what we're doing to avoid pressing traps, etc. So this is the attacking side. The other little bit here is like, how often are they crossing the ball as box cross percentage? So like usually heavy cross teams are less effective in the attack up on the top left. And then goalkeeper pass length is basically how are they starting their possessions from the goalkeeper. Again, really, it's a jumble of stuff that you're just trying to get a quick profile of as you start your analysis process for the week.
And then, you're obviously looking at it specifically a Newcastle lens, right? And you're looking at it and you're kind of, how does this compare? So it makes sense to me that Newcastle look quite strong for high press shots, right? Because Eddie Howe wants to push a very high press. We see Alexander Isak, we see Almiron, Anthony Gordon pretty much sitting on the opposition box every time they have a goal kick. So like things like that make sense to me because we're continuously pushing on. The column that catches my eye on the right then would be the percentile, because this kind of allows you to kind of get a feel for where you are in comparison to the other teams in the league, right? And I think that's probably where you get to make your own assessment of, okay, those numbers look good, but how are we comparing to everyone else? And there's, to me, looks like some pretty high numbers there.
And yeah, the attack was good. I think you have to be comfortable with the attack. Like maybe they get a little more counterattacking. Set piece expected goals fell off last year versus the year before. I don't have a reason for that necessarily. They were very good the year before, and so that's something that going into preseason, you're like, all right, how do we improve that again so that we can be among the best teams in the league? But overall,
I know the answer. I know the answer to this. Kieran Trippier got injured.
Yeah, and then he played a whole summer tournament, and he's getting a little on the old side, and so you might need some backup delivery guys. That's important too.
Yeah. Interesting to note. I absolutely love this. I could sit here and look at this all day.
Well, you're a football manager fan, so like this is naturally in your wheelhouse, as it were. And in fact, they took a bunch of stuff that we pioneered and they put that in the game. So there you are.
Yeah, and you can, and again, I know from our Irish Mags WhatsApp group, we have a lot of football manager enthusiasts in there who'll be rubbing their hands as they look at this, and it won't surprise them at all. I think it's interesting as well. I think the next graphic is probably the most interesting, because this is where we've seen a huge change, or let's say a decrease, in terms of our defensive phase. And again, the context, as you know, Ted, the season before last, we equaled Man City with the best defensive record in the Premier League. And that had a huge drop off this season that's gone. Obviously, we know there was injuries, goalkeeper injured, and various different things. But this will kind of paint the picture of what changed season on season, right?
Sure. And, counterattacking shots conceded, you were in the first percentile, which isn't great. Like you were giving up a lot consistently on the counterattack. That's dangerous. Where that possession was given up, that's like one of the first things you're going to want to focus on, right? Because you can't let teams run through your midfield and then have easy shots on goal. Shots conceded also, went up. The quality of the shots was up a little bit, but just the volume was much higher, and that's a big problem. Set piece expected goals also like dropped a bunch. Part of that might have simply been because they were allowing more attacks and more possessions that were knocked out for corners. Then like that might be these are all things that you look at to be able to say, okay, what's going well and what's not. The year before, basically Newcastle had a great press. It was able to shut people down. It was able to limit the amount of shots that other teams created. This year, they were a little worse than average. They went from basically the 89th percentile in expected goals conceded down to the 23rd. And that is all the difference in your league table right there. That's the entirety of the thing. So the question coming into the summertime is, all right, how do we restore this to the quality that it was a year before? What sort of players do we need to look at in order to kind of bolster the squad to be able to do that without losing the attack? And then, can we have a much better balance across both areas, or do we need to make some adjustments from a tactical perspective to simply accommodate the players that we currently have?
And I would assume, Ted, then, I mean, we would need more time and more grasp, but if you were to look at this over the course of a season, like if what we're looking at is very much a snapshot, kind of to guide our minds as to where the main issues lie or where we need to look. It's not so much here's the answer, it's this is the focus area you need to look at. But I'm sure a lot of these could be attributed to different points in the season. We obviously added Champions League to our campaign for the first time in 20 odd years. So where the games were high intensity or 3 games in a week, I'm sure we could see variations or dips and troughs and roller coaster graphics. And then combining that with, we hate speaking about it, but the level and amount of injuries we had. There was a time from November, kind of December, through to February, March, where we were dreadful, but equally we lost our goalkeeper, a couple of centre backs. We were just having an absolute crisis.
Right. And defensive consistency and consistency in the lineup is usually pretty key. Like those things are often tied together. Like you can't just chop and change regularly in your back line and maybe your defensive midfielder and have that continue to be an area of strength. And so we've seen that.
This is just crazy. I mean, it's things we know anecdotally, but it's just so. It becomes so much clearer when you see it. Obviously, you get your head around, if you're not used to seeing a graph like this and the numbers, once you kind of see what it's telling you, wow, it's just lighting up my eyes here. I actually just want to go and play some Football Manager now, but I really shouldn't. Okay, and then I guess, Ted, like, is the natural flow here then? Obviously, you're using this data to advise a manager, advise a club where to look, where the focus areas, where you got to problem solve. And as we said, the key focus of today's podcast is going to be on players as being a part of that solution, not the complete solution, but a big part of that. So I think, sticking with the defensive side of things, I think it's common knowledge. We have a couple of things going on in Newcastle. Number one, first and foremost, we've got 2 centre backs who are on very long-term injuries, both Sven Botman and Jamal Lascelles. Both did their ACL, both out to what we expect until the end of the calendar year. So we're really kind of down to Fabian Schär, who is a miracle in himself in terms of how he stays fit. He must have played about 70 games this season, including the Euros. And then we're kind of falling back on Dan Burn, and we've just signed Lloyd Kelly. But the most common kind of consensus from everyone is that we're looking at signing a right-sided centre-back. And you and I had a quick chat about this. We looked at some of the players that Newcastle are linked with, and a couple of names seem to be recurring. So we thought we'd maybe focus on some of those for that right centre-back role. So the 2 players we're going to look at are Malik Thiaw of AC Milan and Antonio Silva of Benfica. And we'll start with Malik Thiaw. So this is a player, Ted, you're quite familiar with. He's still very young. He's only 22, but apparently has been on Newcastle's radar, if not for the last year, even more than a year. And some would have you believe it's even 2 years in the making. So that you would expect Newcastle to be looking at data like this, right?
Yes, quite probably. So there's a couple different ways to look at center backs. Like center backs are the ones where you're like most cautious from a data perspective because they do so much stuff that's off the ball, and a lot of the event data that's profiled here is on the ball actions. StatsBomb sort of pioneered some elements of off the ball, and they're going to have sort of tracking data by the end of the year. But currently, like this is one of the ways that we look at it, and so, with some caution, these radars are basically meant to give you quick profiles. They don't usually tell you the whole story about what a player does and doesn't do. So I did some scouting on Thiaw as well. Plays for AC Milan, so plays for a very good team already, a team that's often in possession and wants to have possession. And he's a really unique profile for a center back in that he is a very aggressive pressing center back. He's one of those ones that is going to destroy things from the center. And he has a ton of tackles for his position, which is quite unusual. And so he's going to be comfortable playing as part of either a 2 or a 3. Then he's the destroyer role. So he's going to blow things up as it comes through, often potentially from that right side where you would get a right-footed inverted wide forward coming from the left. I find him to be really interesting, and I think it's kind of an exciting profile. both of the players that are on this list sort of stand out in terms of stats and also age profile. Like they feel very clearly that they are data finds or potential data finds. Now, it doesn't mean the rule of transfer summers is that no one knows anything. It's all made up. It's all a bunch of nonsense. It's all not actually happening until it happens. And in some cases it happens and you're like, oh, well, that was obvious. And it's difficult to tell like one way or another, like which things are real. So I think TL is actually pretty interesting, possibly not as exciting as the next one. He's like 194. So he's quite a big player. He's a very good mover, presses the ball a lot, destroys a lot. He's almost a defensive midfielder as a center back.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, because you talked about his aggression, you talked about his high number of tackles, he's closing down a lot. And it's just, I'm already starting to think, and again, thinking Football Manager, I'm looking at some of his aerial numbers there, right? And he is known to be quite tall. But it seems like his strengths aren't necessarily, it doesn't mean he's weak in the air, obviously. I don't, anyone that high and that tall isn't going to be weak in the air, probably. But it's not like traditionally you might see a 6'4", 6'5". Sorry, we speak in feet and inches still over here.
Sure.
It's not like traditionally a big, really, really tall defender. You would just say, oh yeah, he's just going to win everything in the air and be a threat from set pieces. This is a player who, although he is that tall, a lot of his strengths actually do not necessarily lie in his aerial strength and his aerial battles. Sure,
and I think that's probably fair for the Premier League. Like if you're, Dan Burn is very tall and quite good in the air. He has like 3.6 aerial wins per 90 or something like that, which is, among the best in the world. He wins like just over 72%, I think, on average. I haven't looked at season on season what that looks like. So he's good. TL would be a little closer to average in his area wins, but like you're not relying on him to win the ball in the air all the time. He's not playing in lower England football or Irish football where the ball is constantly in the air, and that's a very important thing. He's destroying play, he's recycling it back into your attack as quickly as possible, and hopefully then when it comes back, somebody beats the press, then he's able to handle sort of 1v1 duels that with faster strikers.
Okay. And I also really, my eye is drifting now onto his kind of his dribbling and his kind of, I mean, not necessarily ball progression, but we see a player like Fabian Schär, who is really comfortable on the ball, kind of likes kind of covering yards, bringing the ball forward, and also has really good distribution. And I think even looking at the Euros just gone, I think there was the most recent England, was it the final or the semi-final? I think it was John Stones who ran like half the length of the field and passed out 2 or 3 players. And that's a hell of an asset for a centre back. And I can see it looks like Theo obviously is quite strong when it comes to like dribbling and taking on players for a defender. Am I reading that correctly?
I think that he's about in the same level as a Fabian Schär in terms of dribble and carry. So moving the ball forward a little bit, that's not something that they're relied on necessarily. And Milan in particular tend to stock their teams with midfielders that are able to take that. So like if he's able to find Bruno effectively in and then like let Bruno do his work, or who do you have playing on the right as a fullback these days?
It would be, well, if it's not Trippier, it would be Livramento.
Okay, and then on the left side is
sorry, it would. Well, there's a bit of a debate now. Lewis Hall it's expected.
Yeah,
he might
28
be the guy,
million.
or,
Yeah, he's So you potentially got a kid over there. Yeah, so that what you're relying on this guy to do is not necessarily to be your John Stones. He's somebody that's more. People think of bad things about David Luiz, but David Luiz is like that type of destroyer center back mold. And often in pressing systems that have a back four, you have one partner that cleans things up and you have one partner that goes and destroys things. The other thing that you could think of is like if you needed to put Kyle Walker back there as a center back, which often has happened, like he's got the pace and the athletic ability to clean that up. At somewhere like Arsenal, both of those players have pace and athletic ability that they're playing in Gabriel and William Saliba. So this is a little bit more like that. He's probably not as capable of opening up play, but he wasn't required to do that. So you can't necessarily hold them against him because that wasn't a thing that Milan needed much of.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose it's down to the type of play. And I think we often debate, are we going to just keep playing the same way under Eddie Howe? And again, that's probably another podcast in itself, but you get the feeling that he likes his 4-3-3. He kind of knows what he wants to do when he has the players at his disposal, because frustratingly last year he didn't have that. So
Let's
before
move
we move
on,
on,
sir.
then
No, let's move on. The next one's so exciting.
Okay, I had one really quick question. Just, do you know what? Let me come back to it, so because we can group it. It's more thinking about the pairing. So I'll come back to that at the end. I'll hold my thought. So we're going to then jump over to one that Ted's very excited about, and therefore I'm very excited about, and that is Antonio Silva, who is a 20-year-old centre back at Benfica. Was in the Portugal squad at the Euros. Didn't really see much, if not any, game time, but has a big future ahead of him, and a lot of clubs looking at him, Ted, I believe.
So Benfica are a talent factory unlike almost anywhere else. They seem to produce a 50 to 100 million a year play, or pound player every other year. Like, it's really crazy. And this is another one of those ones where they've got João Neves, who's a defensive midfielder who is rumored to be a very expensive target for PSG this year.
Yes.
And then you get Antonio Silva, who is probably the Portuguese starting center back of the future. And that has typically meant he will be a Champions League winning caliber center back. Usually they have a center back good enough to sort of captain a side that is able to win the Champions League sometime during the peak of their career. He looks like the next candidate. And at age 20, he's not as tall as a Tiaw. He might not be quite as fast, but he does seem to be a little bit better at scoring goals from set pieces. And he just seems like so confident, so able to clean things up. He's a little more versatile in what he does. I don't think he's awesome in the air, but that's not what you're looking for. And I think he is better at opening up play with the ball. So he's better commanding the ball at his feet and creating that creating open play for teammates.
Okay. And do you see him? You use the word destroyer a lot with Malik Thiaw. Do you see Silva having still a similar profile in terms of the destroyer and the cleaner up?
I think he's a little more well-rounded, and so you will probably also see like a difference in price, right? Like this would be cultured in the football terms, football manager terms almost. He's a cultured center back versus the other one is an excellent athletic center back. I think that his passing progression is certainly a level or two above on what we see from Tiaw. His sort of 1v1 ability defensively might not be quite the same, and he might be a slightly different role. So that's, again, something you care about when you're doing your recruitment work. But man, is he exciting. And he looks like a guy. Actually, both of these center backs look like ones that the recruitment department said, we need an anchor for the next 5 to 10 years. And that's what we're going to be able to target here. And it might cost us a bunch of money, but that's the level of player that we're looking to get in.
Yeah, and again, with all respect to Fabian Schär, he's not a young defender. As I said, there's a lot of football in those legs, and we've had to rely on him far too much. We had to play him when he was injured, so it makes sense that if you're Newcastle, you have again, we don't know what their budget is, but if they have 150 million to spend, that a big chunk of it should be and will be going towards the right centre back role. And as you said, this guy, Antonio Silva, who we know, and I know from Football Manager from a couple of years now, is only 20 years old still, which is incredible. And Malik Thiaw is 22. Talk to me about being pressured, change in pass. There's a spike there catching my eye.
So effectively what that means is when you're under pressure, how much does your pass percentage change? And there are a couple different ways to look at it. Not every pass is the same. There's a level of difficulty involved in the pass. But it's something that we look at because the press has become so much more important, especially in the Premier League, than it used to be. And so it's an element that says that how comfortable are you on the ball when under pressure and sort of completing passes. It's a big deal. Someone like a Jamal Lascelles, better in the air. I think aren't all of your center backs 30 plus years old as well? Like Schär and
with the exception of Sven Botman, who's kind of 23 maybe.
Okay, so Botman is younger, but coming off an ACL injury, and you don't know like at what point. Like those are still as good as we are at repairing those to a high quality. Every once in a while, say like 1 in 20, you end up with a spot where it's complicated and it doesn't quite heal right, and sometimes it ends a player's career. Not saying that any of that is true, but I see sort of the need to sort of risk basically cover yourselves and have somebody
Yeah.
that's a good option for the long term. So Lascelles would be somebody that's better in the air than Antonio Silva, but certainly the passing is like light years different, and that's what you're seeing here.
Yeah, especially because it talks about being pressured, and we know like everyone in the Premier League now wants to do a high press. Thank you, Klopp. Thank you, Pep. Because again, these defenders aren't getting a chance on the ball, especially with the inclination to play out from the back and do short kickouts and all of that.
Well, the other
Super
thing that
interesting
you'll
think
choose to
about.
do is in a center back pairing, you basically have to choose one of the two to allow them to open play, and you would choose not to allow Antonio Silva if you can. But if he can still open play fairly well while under pressure, like that's a superpower.
Yeah, especially again, as we said, at the age of 20 years old. Okay, yeah, I'm excited about Antonio Silva now. We've had a lot of Malik Thiaw talk, especially in the Irish Mags pod and in our group. But again, I don't know if this is a player. What I was going to ask you as well before I ask you my ultimate question is it a surprise to you that this is a player that hasn't been already picked up? When you think about the Portuguese league and you think about the money that goes in there, especially you mentioned Benfica, the talent factory. Is it a surprise to you he hasn't yet been picked up? Because he's probably been showing this potential for at least 2 seasons fairly solidly.
I don't
He's still only
think
20.
I don't think the world became as obsessed with young center backs until this past summer. In which case, we're seeing crazy deals like Lenny Yoro, who
Yes.
probably is not as good as this right now, go for 62 million euros. So that's also part of the question, right? Like Benfica sell well. There hasn't been a lot of cash available for teams to splash. The big European giants are in a trough in terms of financially. The Premier League teams that are not necessarily in the trough, but they're all worried about PSR, are still being a little careful. And so that's probably why that's the case, especially knowing how well they sell and how, when you always have money and you've got 4 prospects that are 50 million or above, like it's, you get to be choosy about what you actually let these guys go for.
Yeah, if you have it to spend. Okay, final question on defenders, and the one I've been holding on. Because what we'll want to know, especially the Irish Mags and the Newcastle fans alike, so we see Sven Botman, again, fingers crossed, the ACL kind of thing gets sorted out. We see him as being very much one for the future as well. If he stays around, he's still very young, and he started life very well at Newcastle. Out of Silva and Malik Thiaw, who would you see as being a better partner for Sven Botman? I suppose just knowing what you know about Botman himself.
Well, what do you want Botman to? What do you think his best role is? I'll ask you for some expertise here. Like, is he going to be a player that gets involved and gets stuck in, or is he going to be somebody that kind of cleans up? Do you need somebody that is definitely going to open play better?
He's not. Yeah, he's not because of what Fabian Schär does, and Fabian Schär's kind of confidence in the ball and all that. He does seem to be the stopper. He does seem to kind of be the last hurrah in terms of breaking down an attack or being the last defender. He's not the quickest in the world as well. He does have a weapon of a left foot, but recovery tackles, just super strong, good positioning. But again,
very good in the
not
airs.
necessarily the other way.
Yeah, very good in the air is what I'm seeing. The opening of play, less strong. Some of his defensive actions, like you're like, okay, this is fine, but like he does definitely appear to be a quite defensive center back. And if you think that he's a defensive center back and that's what you have for the future, you think that the longevity of the other players that you have at center back, might be in question for a year or two from now. Like you definitely need players, if you want to play at the Champions League level, that are able to be a bit better at center back attacking duties. And that some of that's driving into the middle. Like just think of the John Stones archetype as what you kind of will need as a very good team that is able to, one, clean up stuff that gets through from your midfield that's mostly trying to destroy this stuff, and two, be able to recycle it back as quickly as possible into the right areas so that your attackers get the sort of best benefit and best angles of attack.
Okay. I'm just going to have to test this in Football Manager to see how it plays out. Again, Antonio Silva to me is a dream signing. I think it's a lot more expensive than Malik Thiaw, especially seeing what we see now. But already picturing, even though, as we said,
he's like the level of Bruno. That's sort of the level of signing that you're looking at, or Ishak. Like you get a young player that was super exciting on the stats profiles that scouts very well. You're like, yes, if we can get one of those a year and just try and keep them, like the quality of our team will go up. You guys had an awesome steal in Minte. and unfortunately had to sell via PSR. I was
Yeah.
more excited about him as a young right wide forward than almost anybody I've seen in the last year. And it was a really good find because it wasn't expected that he would be as good as he was coming out of the Danish league. He then plays at Feyenoord for a very good head coach, and he's just a problem. And so we'll see how that one progresses. But I credit to the recruitment department for what was a really good piece of work, even if business needs meant that they had to sell him.
Yeah, we're still not over it. It's quite upsetting. Just such a good high potential player that could have been exciting, and especially and pertinently, he plays in a role that we now are trying to strengthen. And that's probably a very good segue into our next position, because the other role we're looking at in this Newcastle team, Ted, is it's kind of evolving. Is it the right wing or the right inside forward kind of role? Obviously, the way football has changed and roles have changed. So we've picked out two players that I suppose for us and for me and for what we see in the kind of transfer rumor world are quite realistic signings for us, and also ones that haven't gone away. So the two players we're going to look at are Anthony Elanga at Nottingham Forest and Brian Mbeumo at Brentford, who we know that Ted is going to know very well as well. There's a lot of, last week we named out about 15 players rumored for this position, but these seem to be two that are quite realistic and also just aren't going away. So maybe if we start with Anthony Elanga, and you can maybe tell us, Ted, potentially why we should forget about Minta and think about Elanga or even Mbeumo.
Am I going to disappoint you and say that you should forget about neither of those players and bring Minta back on loan if you can? Because
yes, almost as much as when you mentioned Thierry Henry, it's kind of level par for upsetting me today.
What you're seeing in both Elanga and Mbeumo is you're seeing Premier League average players effectively. And it might be that in a better team, they can enhance their performance. They're still like pretty much the right age. And Mbeumo was outstanding at the championship. He was part of a very good Brentford attack that was multi-pronged. I think one of the interesting things about these players and adjustments that Eddie Howe has kind of had to make from his time at Bournemouth is, if you remember Bournemouth, like they had what I hate, basically, a bunch of wide wingers. Like they love to play wingers, like Matt Ritchie, just chucking the ball into the box, as many times as possible. And then things like bouncing out. And it's not to say that they didn't have some success with it, although one of the reasons they were relegated is they couldn't control the midfield very well as well, which is the thing that wingers often have problem. It's hard to be like wide constantly and then come back inside and tuck in. These players are not that type of player. They're much more possession oriented. They're pass oriented. I think one of the difficulties that you have, though, is that they're not super able to beat their man off the dribble. And so that's a thing that Minta clearly hit on the profile. And he was one of those young players that could have the ball at his feet in the box, and you didn't know what he was going to do. That type of situation is really difficult for defenders to sort of get close and lunge in at. These guys can beat somebody. They have a good burst, and they can score goals. They can also create for their teammates. But they're fine at the Premier League level. So it's more of a steady, solid choice without breaking the bank. And I don't think that's wrong necessarily, especially given the current situation at Newcastle, and maybe Anthony Gordon continues to come along as well. You do have a very good top tier center forward, but they're just not. These are transfers that are fine. They're not transfers that are exciting, and that's the difference between them, and that's okay. Like sometimes the sticker book on the transfer matches the excitement that you should have. And so what's the prices that are quoted for these guys right now?
It kind of ranges. I think this whole PSR thing has really kind of messed up everyone's heads. If you'd have asked me how much Elliot Anderson might have cost or be worth, we were all like 15 million, something like that. And then the rumor was that he went for 35. So, we're looking at a Nottingham Forest player on the screen now. So if Newcastle to go back in and say, hey, well, now we'd like to buy Elanga.
Right.
Again, if that 35 million for Anderson is true, then Nottingham Forest have to look at somebody like Anthony Elanga and say, right, well, he's much more influential to your attacking phase. He's got, the numbers to back it up, the pace, everything he has. He destroyed us and destroyed, I think it was Dan Byrne when we played Forest, which we'll remember was St. Stephen's Day on the 26th of December, and they hammered us. But, Elanga for me would, based on that 35 million for Anderson, I'm looking at a 40 to 50 million pound player, Premier League for
I
him.
think
But
40. I think 40 is probably top end. Same
mm,
for Buemo. So like you're looking like in that price range. Maybe there is a PSR effect where it's back scratching and inflating some of the
yeah,
fees on each way, so that some of the times that you've seen this, but also like transfers between Premier League teams just tend to have larger stickers these days. Like they
mm.
all have more money, and then that carries on into the European ones, unless like you step up with a bunch of cash and you're like, hey, we will offer you all this cash in year one because we have cash to get your player out, but we need a 10% discount for what you'd sell to somebody else, or 15. And then you hope that it's not an auction situation where everybody in the world's excited about them. So I think is not a bad choice. I just don't see, like, if he progresses from where he's at, he's totally fine. The second question is, if you play in a slightly better style, you have better players around you, can you improve your output? Also, potentially, yes. So it's not that it should be disappointing. I think this is probably fine and fits a need. And fits a need is perfectly okay too. You don't want to go into the season not having depth in this area, end up having an injury, and then be like, all right, well, now we have nothing and we're trying to scrap back into the Champions League places. That's a disaster.
Yeah, and I think it's common knowledge, or at least it's assumed common knowledge, that Eddie Howe does have a slight preference for a little bit of a safety first approach when it comes to recruitment. There's a lot of whispers that, when we were signing, I think we mentioned this last week, when we were signing the likes of whether it was Bruno or Isaac, or even Tonali, that there was a preference for Conor Gallagher or Scott McTominay or Dominic Calvert-Lewin from an Eddie Howe perspective. We don't know how true that is, but it kind of makes sense.
I would say, and this may get me in trouble, but when we were at Brentford, we would look at Bournemouth's recruitment policy and we called them soft Brexit. because
Okay.
it seemed to be sort of very UK and British Isles based type recruitment, and that again makes sense. Now it might be that foreign players may be a little more difficult to communicate with, or culturally it makes the coach's job easier, which is not completely unfair. But when you're talking about wanting to have the best team in the world and be part of the Champions League, you don't really have the luxury of just shopping in and around England. Like you need
Yeah.
to actually be a little more aggressive in the transfer market and bringing players in that can improve the quality and level of your team. And that needs to be something that's part of the focus. And it may, much like the Brendan Rodgers era at Liverpool, it may be something that's an ongoing, undercurrent inside of the Newcastle Brain Trust. Dan Ashworth's gone now. You've got Mitchell, right? Paul Mitchell coming in.
Yeah.
He worked at Monaco, which had a very flexible transfer policy. Like they're probably going to try and find a middle ground between those two perspectives. And we'll see over the course of maybe the next two windows, kind of which perspective wins out.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, especially as we said, Newcastle may want to bring in an Antonio Silva, and they would probably love to bring in Nico Williams, but you can't do it all at once. And
Right.
equally, are there risks involved as well? And yeah, PSR. Okay, we've got Brian and Buemo on the screen here then, and this intrigues me because from what I can see, I've seen various polls across Twitter or X or Twix or whatever we're going to call it today, in terms of who would the fans prefer to see when you compare an Mbeumo to even an Alanga. I think Rafinha's name has been thrown out there, Albert Bowen, and Mbeumo seems to be topping quite a few of the fans' preference, and I think that's largely a lot more of the fan base will have seen him play. Obviously for Brentford, he does probably offer more considerable goal threat. He did. I think it's fair to say he stepped up quite well when Ivan Toney was out for such a long time with the ban that he had between himself and Wissa. So again, I think you mentioned the point, Ted, that like Alanga, this isn't a player that runs down the line and crosses the ball like a traditional winger. It's probably you're not looking for that from him if you're signing Brian Mbeumo. It's because of what he offers, I suppose, cutting inside or getting into the box.
Yeah, I think he's as much sort of a hybrid 8-10 as he is a wide forward. And I think there were times that Brentford used him as a destructive attacking 8. So it does have a bit more flexibility in his game to be able to do that. But a little bit like Elanga, he's not going to beat a ton of people off the dribble. He's very capable of scoring goals and probably has a pretty good nose for a goal inside of the box. But if you need him to be the one that's transitioning the ball up the pitch all the time, like that's not what Mbeumo has done historically.
Okay. And in terms of his spikes, especially looking at last season, I think, and again, I'm thinking about, okay, if Ivan Toney was in that team, does Brian Mbeumo's role does it differ than when Toney wasn't in the team? And then I'm trying to flick that in my mind to, okay, well, if I put Mbeumo in on the right hand side for Newcastle with Isak up there, and how does that kind of change? Where would you see his spike is, or like what suits him the best if you were to decide on his role first rather than playing him a certain way based on who he's playing with?
So he is pretty good at sort of what we call pass OBV, so on ball value. He's like 70th percentile, something like that. Dribble and carry value, creating expected goals for his teammates. He's only sort of in the, right in the middle of expected goal output. Again, these things can improve on the population if you're in a better team. So if you've got an Ishak who you think is as good, you've got a Bruno there, probably a bit better midfield when healthy at Newcastle, certainly. Touches in the box is fine. He's comfortable in possession, and he can do like good defensive work rate. So I think that's fair. Then, he knows about shot choices and good shots. Like that's something that would have been part of his DNA and his training at Brentford in all these years. I don't know what his peak is. Maybe it's around here. Maybe he is one of the sort of top quartile, so top 25%, top 20% attacking mid in a good team, right? And he'll do the work to be able to do so. That's maybe my guess, but he's probably middle tier or a bit above. And if you end up getting one of the, say you have the 10th best attacking midfielder or the 15th best attacking midfielder in the Premier League for a reasonable price, that's not so bad, because all the ones above you, like you're either getting out of the academy and they've magically appeared like a Saka, or you have a player that you had to spunk out sort of 75 million for, which isn't necessarily something the budget can handle at the moment.
Yeah, and you mentioned risk as well. There's risk in terms of blowing a considerable percentage of your budget on a player that for want of a better phrase isn't Premier League proven, even though it's the biggest cliche maybe out there. Considering we could see Minta go into that Brighton team and tear things up and produce some incredible numbers and performances. But I think in our world, an Mbeumo signing might make sense. But for me, and I think for the fan base, that would be on the assumption that we are spending a considerable amount or taking that element of risk to bring in the Bruno, Isak kind of level player from abroad in another position. As we said, if we saw Antonio Silva and Brian Mbeumo arrive tomorrow, I think you'll see a lot of smiling Newcastle fans out there in the world.
I don't have any problem with that. You have a budget, and how you fill out that budget with, in order to try and hit your goals. And your goals are clearly be in the Champions League basically every other year. It's a very competitive space. The budget is more restricted than I think people thought it would be, partly because of PSR. I think that we would have expected to see a higher expenditure from this particular team at this point, and we haven't. But if you're able to bring in a top tier star every other year, that's a young player that gets into your team and be in that sort of, say, 3rd to 6th level, like that's a pretty happy spot for Newcastle at the moment. Just knowing how competitive it is, like it's not only 4 teams that are good anymore. Like it's a lot of teams that are good and have a bunch of money and are better at recruiting players from around the world than they ever have been before.
Yeah, and equally, I think you mentioned earlier about Premier League clubs selling to each other. I'm sure a lot of Forest fans and maybe people internally in Forest, some of them might say Newcastle are a rival of Nottingham Forest, right? They expect to not be a million miles apart from each other. Now, Newcastle probably wouldn't agree in terms of internal or fans, but suddenly you're going to go, well, why should we sell this player to you? But again, that's where PSR comes back around and says, well, you're the only one that can give me the cash I need to be in the green. It is a messy world out there for sure. I'll be interested to see what Football Manager 2025 has to say about this in terms of replicating it. Okay, we've gone through quite a lot of players there. And Ted, thank you for all those. I mean, I know there's a bit of work you have to prepare those radars for us, but they're super interesting to just get a glimpse. And I'm sure a lot of fans out there are probably rethinking Elanga and Mbeumo now in terms of excitement levels, maybe. But at the same time, as you said, for budget reasons, for risk reasons, for what we need right now, for depth, for players that are ready to go, both really good signings. Any final thought? I suppose I could throw a wildcard question at you and say, well, who would you sign? And I know you look at a lot of this stuff, a lot of this data, a lot of these different players, and you've got a finger on the pulse in terms of transfers. A player I've heard you talk about, or I've seen you write about a lot, is Jonathan David, who did pop up in the Newcastle transfer rumor stratosphere last week. There is a common joke that Fabrizio Romano must be paid to tweet about Jonathan David, because he just tweets about him maybe every transfer window for the last 3 years. Any other players that come to mind that you think perfect fit based on kind of what we've talked about?
Well, I think David was more of a fallback plan in case Ishak ended up, somebody ended up forcing their hand, and that would have made a lot of sense. I think David is a good player, different type of player than Ishak, maybe a bit better of a passer, but not necessarily as good as a target. Ishak never quite filled out as we thought he might when he was really young. And so he's very good at what he does. It's not a knock on him. It's just that sometimes when a kid's 18, 19 years old and then he gets older, you're like, all right, how much is he going to fill out? Is he going to be an Erling Haaland, or is he going to be like, something between an Erling Haaland and a Peter Crouch? And those are questions that you don't know until you get to, a lot of time in the weight room. David is a little more compact. He's not a true speedster, but he can stretch play a little bit. He's good with the buildup, and he's gotten very good at finishing with both feet, which I think is quite valuable, especially if you have a versatile attack that can come from either side. Sometimes, like, players very clearly as a forward have a strong side and a weak side that they're able to take on the ball and be able to finish from. I think David is one of the better sort of two-footed finishers that we've seen in our scouting recently. I'm not sure that he makes as much sense for Newcastle now, given the current needs. He's not a right-sided, comfortable player. He's definitely more of a center forward these days. He plays more flexibly for Canada, but that's because Canada doesn't have the depth of talent there. But I also think that his team really wants to move him this summer, and so that's like an open question. They might need to re-up, a contract extension just so they can roll that over for another year. And one of the problems that outside of really young center backs and really young players, and whatever it is that Chelsea's doing, there just isn't like a ton of big time cash out there for somebody that is like 90th percentile, but not 99th percentile in what they do. So I think David probably is more of a comfortable fit at a very good Champions League team, not in the Premier League, as opposed to, for you guys, if you have that number one striker role filled.
Yeah, and I think there is a consensus that Newcastle do or should be looking for a striker. We do have, obviously, as you said, Alexander Isak. Callum Wilson, even as of today, appears to be going nowhere. The problem is that at no point in the season are both of them, have they ever really been fit at Newcastle?
They would definitely like
a fleeting moment.
Wilson and Wilson's ligaments and hamstrings are like almost diametrically opposed in his availability there. He's a tough kid. But,
it's tough because his goal record is there. His goals, when he does play, he does score, right? I think that's probably the biggest challenge is that he's just not available. So I think there's a consensus that Newcastle might be in the market for a striker, maybe a younger player who's not expecting to start, who can play behind, kind of like Isak would be in ahead of him. But equally, we don't have as many games this year. That's the reality of not qualifying for Europe. And we can thank Manchester United's FA Cup win out of the blue for that, sadly. And we're still not over that either.
When Newcastle signed Callum Wilson, we looked at that and went, ooh. And the reason why is simply because like the most predictive element of future ACL injuries is past ACL injuries. And also the most predictive element of soft tissue is significant injuries like that. And so you're like, look, he's going to be available maybe half the time if you're lucky. And that's basically what's happened there. And he's been good when he's been available. But availability in many cases for a pretty good player is the best ability. And that's also one thing that David has. Like David has been consistently available throughout all of his career in France for the most part.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way of circling back to what we mentioned at the beginning of the show, right? Where Newcastle had a little bit more of a haphazard approach or maybe a needs-must approach in the transfer window, right? Callum Wilson was available. They had 20 million. He scores goals when he plays. And I think we've had a legacy, or we kind of had some players that in a similar mold. Matt Targett comes to mind. I think he's on huge money at Newcastle. It might have been 15 million. I could be dreaming that, but he was a left back, Premier League available. We needed one, so we bought him, and you kind of end up a little bit stuck or hamstrung by that. So I think we all collectively hope that the signings that are being made now and the scouting approach, and as we've been saying all along, the more intensive data analysis and research, the appointment of an actual full-on recruitment team, people who are fully responsible for doing these things in terms of performance, and fitness, as well as potential and quality. Where before it used to sit with one guy, it doesn't happen anymore, which is super helpful for us. And as I said, frustratingly, Newcastle feel like we've been late or last to the party in a lot of that stuff, but we can definitely feel the change. Ted, I've taken a lot of your time today, and I could, as I said, I could spend hours talking to you about a lot of this stuff. It's super interesting. I think we'd love to revisit some of this stuff as things progress within the transfer window, and maybe we'll get you on again in the future, especially if things are moving in a Newcastle world. A request from me on behalf of the Irish Mags. Let's hear some more about Newcastle in your podcast and in the transfer flow in the newsletter. And I'm going to quickly shout out, folks, any of the Irish Mags who are listening, make sure you are subscribed to the transfer flow. We've got Ted's, obviously, Twitter on the screen. And Ted, I'll give you that opportunity. Maybe if you want to shout out, where can people actually find you without giving away your postcode and address and details?
So, yeah, I've been on Twitter for, I don't know, 14, 15 years at Mixed Nuts. But the new thing is the transfer flow. We are a daily newsletter, basically looking at transfers for the most part. We will transition into team and game analysis and gambling as we get into the season. I used to be a former professional sports bettor, and we're going to talk about my picks. I'm not going to sell picks, but like we'll try and make you better at doing that as we get towards the closer area. And the concept around that is like, can we help you lose one less bet every month? Like, because it's not as exciting, it's not as sexy, but the reality is if we can help you avoid a bet that is a bad one, like we've definitely helped your long-term bankroll and financial future there. So yeah, it's at the transferflow.com and transferflow.com where you can subscribe. We also have a podcast that at the moment in the summertime is kind of 2 times a week. As we get into the season, it'll be 3 times. We have some former directors of recruitment that show up on the podcast. I think we're going to have Ian Graham, who's a former director of research at Liverpool, on the pod at some point in the near future. And it's partly, us doing analysis and making fun of things. Sometimes it's just enjoy talking about football with your friends who happen to be really smart and have done the job professionally. So a lot of the ITK world is, quote ITK, and sometimes they get things right. We don't even pretend that we're ITK. Like sometimes we know stuff, but really we have all the experience in actually doing the job. And so hopefully we bring a lot more credibility to the transfer world and evaluating talent movement than anybody else in the world of football.
Well, you've definitely reassured me in terms of, like the 45 minutes we've had to look at some of those particular players and analysis that we've looked at. To think that that's properly and definitely happening at a big level within the club, within Newcastle, is far more reassuring. And again, you made the point. That's where we unearthed Yakuba Minta, and we're also investing in our youth academy, where we've never done that in the past. Completely neglected over the years gone by. Excellent. Well, Ted, thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. I hope the listeners, all of you, found that incredibly interesting as well. You'll find a link to Ted and all of the transfer flow in the description below, as long as a link to all the Irish Mag socials. And really quickly, shout out for folks, everyone listening. We have a new website, theirishmags.com, which has just launched this week. So do check that out as well. It'll be the home of all our Irish Mags content. And I'm fully planning to do a little write-up on some of the profiles and some of the content that Ted just talked us through there. We will be back for more Irish Magnus next week. So until then, all we can say is, Hawaii the lads, Slán go fóill, and we'll see you all very soon. Ted, thank you so much once again. Really appreciate your time. And we hope to have you on again the show very soon.